It's become part of the culture to actually talk about watersheds. You can hear them mentioned in city council meetings now, which, 10 years ago would have been a totally different kind of a thing.
Creek work is trending, and we see this not only county-wide, but statewide and all across the nation. And I really feel that we were kind of the starting point here in Contra Costa County.
Leading up to kind of the formation of the symposium and the Watershed Forum in the 90s, a main focus of folks who were concerned about the natural environment was growth politics and sort of looking at urban development and the footprint of urban development and concerned about open space protection. And as some of those growth boundaries started to firm up, I think people wanted to look at how they could take care of the environment close to home. And I think creek and watersheds became an organizing principle for that. And so the Watershed Forum, I think, was an outgrowth of folks wanting to say, yeah, we all want to save national parks, we all want to do our part on global climate change, et cetera, but we also want to make sure that our kids and our neighborhoods have some connection to the natural environment.
The Watershed Forum was very influential in getting people, I think, to raise the awareness of watersheds within our county and the importance of watersheds within the county. One of the reasons why I was so happy to be part of Watershed Forum is they weren't just one vision of what a watershed was. There was a terrific amount of inclusivity in terms of we had developers at the table, we had city planners who were at the table, we did have the Save the Creeks people who were there, we had the people who were the wildlife enthusiasts who were there, but it was a huge diversity.
Most interesting and most important issues for me at the symposia are strategies for communicating with different communities. Contra Costa County is exceedingly diverse. As you go from east to west, or as you go from lower watersheds to upper watersheds, there are class and demographic differences there. And each community organizes itself differently and shares information differently. And if I go into the Marsh Creek watershed in Oakley, and I want to work with people who are there, or if I go into the Wildcat Creek watershed in San Pablo, the strategies are going to be different.
Well, of course, throughout the Bay Area and the East Bay, the environment and wildlife are very important to people. I do think that the Watershed Forum and the symposia have provided a way to channel that into positive action. It's quite lonely to be a small volunteer group in X city. Just having someone to talk to get ideas, of course, to exchange, and to feel that at least to some degree government is behind you has been, I think, really a valuable thing.
Being a good steward of your community, a good steward of the watershed that you live in, whether it's a creek in your backyard or it's going somewhere else to a school or to a flood control channel to help do something. And I think that culture of conservation is vitally important. The funding, the tax dollars, etc., just don't go far enough, so we need people to get out and help out with the various things that watersheds need.
I have nothing but praise for that progression the county has made and the effort they've put into developing relationships with the public and citizens and helping fund it. I consider Contra Costa County at this point a real model.
When the Watershed Forum and the symposium first started, it was really an idea to bring people together to talk about things. And that was the goal, was to coordinate activities. I think we've become much more refined in what we're talking about, as well as skillful in what we're doing in Contra Costa County. We are looked to as a model for other counties in the region, and it's because this started early, and we've really put a huge amount of effort and commitment into doing this work.
Our plants and animals are probably in better shape than many other people's, and still we worry about them. So we'll do as well as anyone else, I think, if this culture can be preserved, if my generation can hand it on to the next one.
All right. For our first award of the 2019 Contra Costa Creek and Watershed Symposium, we have our watershed champion. Let's see if I can move it there. little bit better. Watershed Champion Award. And since 1999, when this kicked off, the Watershed Champion is the award that people strive to get, because that shows that you exemplify everything that we need to preserve and restore our watersheds in Contra Costa County. So, for this year, our 20th anniversary, we are recognizing the team that has led the symposium for all this time. And that is not just one individual or one agency. We have 3 that have helped us to make to this level of success. So I'm going to call a couple agencies, organizations to the stage. The Contra Costa Fish and Wildlife Committee. We have 2 representatives that are going to join us. Yeah. The Contra Costa Department of Conservation and Development. Abby and John, both of you. And then the Contra Costa County Flood Control and Water Conservation District, including Mike Carlson. Mm-hmm. So these 3 agencies together have made the Contra Costa Watershed Forum and Symposium a success for the last 20 years. And so we're taking this moment to recognize all of the work that they have done to help find funding and find organizers and find meeting space and speakers and everything that you all have done over the last 20 years. And you're kind of sharing.
I don't share well.
I know. You don't have to say anything unless you want to. Yes, you can go. I had to twist a lot of arms to get some of my awardees up here. You're welcome. Thank you very much. Thank you all. All right, so the next category, we're doing a twofer right now, is the Watershed Leader Award. And these are individuals that have been working to preserve and restore our watersheds. And their work has helped make the symposium and the forum a success. They've spoken, they've given field trips, and they've just generally been great examples of the type of leadership that we need to make watershed preservation is a key factor in Contra Costa County. So, some are here, some are not. We're going to start with Juliana Gonzalez with the Watershed Project. I just saw her. Oh, there. And the Watershed Project does such great work. Thank you so much for your leadership. And then we also have Helen Fitanity, sorry. I usually get that right. And one of our nominees, or one of our award winners, is not here right now. Heidi Petty with the Resource Conservation District is not here. But she might join us later. So, Helen, come to this side. And that's for you. Thank you so much for your work throughout the county. And we'll get to hear from Helen later on when she talks about creek monitoring and why it's important. And then one very special award that I'm going to come down there for, so I guess I'll take this with me. I can figure it out, is for East Bay Regional Park District Director Whitney Dodson. So I've had the pleasure of knowing Director Dodson for, I think it's 5 years now that I've been serving on the Park Advisory Committee for the East Bay Regional Park District. And on the first field trip, the first board field trip that I ever went on, I had the opportunity to have a conversation and a short walk with Director Dodson, and that has always been a huge factor in why I continue to be so happy to serve the East Bay Regional Park District. He was one of our former watershed champions for the symposium, and this year he is retiring from the board for East Bay Parks. So we wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you for all of your service and everything you've done to preserve the watersheds and creeks and shorelines in Contra Costa County. Thank you. And here, I'll put this on the table. And that is our Watershed Champion and Leader Awards. So next we're going to go to our next presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Brendan.
Thank you. I'll save you the walk. Congratulations to all our award winners. Thank you very much. We've got a nice lineup here before we get to lunch. And first, we're going to start with local artist John Finger. As many of you know from his work on the Watershed Calendar, which is a staple, I'm sure, in many of your homes and offices. And for those of you who are not aware, 2019 is the last year that the Watershed Calendar will be produced. So I'd invite you all to give John a round of applause for his years of service and creativity, and mostly for providing a visual guide for each of us to discover the beauty of our watershed. If you're not familiar with his work, you can check him out at johnfinger.net. Shameless plug there for you, John. John's presentation incorporates one of our themes, which is the intersection of art and the environment. He'll discuss how art has the power to connect and inspire people, something that we all seek to do in our work. And without further ado, here's John Finger.
Well, thank you all for giving me this opportunity to talk to you. When I first got the announcement that the planning was happening for this year's symposium, I was very excited to see the concept of art and nature being focused on, because it looked to me like an opportunity where I might have something to add, and you know, my reaction was kind of, yeah, baby, let's go over to the right side of the brain for a while here. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about is the power of art, the power of the human imagination. It's really a powerful thing, and we have a tendency to look at for solutions in the more I call it STEM-oriented things. That's the big emphasis now, is for that whole world of science and technology and engineering and math. But there's a really important aspect that I'm going to talk about, and a couple different areas of it. It was great hearing Obi talk about his involvement in the art world, and there's many other people. I just recently went to a museum that I never heard of down in Palo Alto, an artist named Tony Foster, who does these wonderful environmental watercolors, huge, and they've built a whole museum for it. I never heard of it, but people like that, like Obi and this Tony Foster, who are just really using their art to get the word out. But I'm actually going to take it another step further and talk about art in the bigger picture, maybe. Mitch made that comment about needing to push the vision, and art is the perfect way to push that vision. And so I'm going to be showing examples of, I started off, I was showing a lot of other artists' examples, and it just sort of ended up being an art history presentation. So I'm actually going to show mostly my own work with some other artists, and when I do, I'll make note of that. This first slide is a painting of mine of Mount Diablo, of course. And if you notice, I crossed my name out on the, I crossed the title artist out. And the reason I did that was to make a point. There's a very famous artist, Wayne Thiebaud. A lot of people know of him, a California artist. Who's best known for painting these pie paintings, but he paints a lot of other stuff. And he makes the comment that he calls himself a painter, not an artist, because the artist is actually something that the audience and the viewer gets to decide whether it's art or not the person creating it. So I've changed this slide maybe to drawer and painter. That was hard to get to that slide. But anyway, So that's the point I wanted to make there. Hey, we got it. Who is this guy? I know quite a few people in this room. I've been doing environmental visual communication work in the Bay Area for over 30 years now. A lot of works for counties, cities, engineering firms, marketing firms. And most well-known probably in this room for the last 15 years, I've done the California the Contra Costa Watershed calendar for the Watershed program. And I wasn't going to be the one to tell you that this is the last year, but since that's already been announced, we can all, it's going to be interesting to see, because I think it is much loved by the community piece, but it'll be interesting to see how that goes over. But I'm going to be talking today more about the other hat that I wear, which is as a painter and a fine artist. I work in a couple different ways. I work in watercolor and oil, and I work in the studio mostly on bigger paintings like this, oil and watercolor, as I said. And in the studio, you have time to actually spend the kind of time it takes to do a painting like this. There's a very popular movement, most of you have probably heard of it, of the plein air painting, where you go out on location and paint, and I've been very involved with that for the last 15 years or so. It's a wonderful activity. It gets people out in nature, but in that situation, I'm forced to work smaller just because of the limitations of light and changing conditions. Again, oil. This is me a couple weeks ago before the snow came up at Echo Summit, Echo Lake, doing a little watercolor of the lake there, and then little 7x10 watercolor framed painting that comes out of that. So. And then when I go somewhere, this is a recent trip to Santa Fe, I'll do a whole bunch of these small paintings, and it was kind of like bringing back my trophies from the trip. And just a couple more of this. Painting, again, the oil painting, this is on the Madison River in Montana. But just going out and just the wonderful experience of going out and painting. A lot of communities now have these events, plein air events, and what's neat about it is not only are the artists out there, but they give out maps, and people will go find the artists and watch them paint and sort of vicariously be involved in the process. So, and this is the last painting I'm going to show of my work in the plein air, the smaller stuff. I'll get more into the content I want to say. This is just sort of an introduction, but just setting up in a redwood forest. This is an 8-inch by 10-inch painting, but just getting to observe the light and the color and the experience, kind of a meditative state to be in. As I said, I'm going to be showing mostly my own work, but when I show another artist's work, it'll be clearly labeled to avoid confusion. I figured Aristotle was a good guy to quote, go with the big guys. But the aim of art is to represent not the outward appearance of things, but their inward significance. So I'm trying to take this whole thing, kind of that sort of level of thinking about art that way, because a lot of times we think about art as outreach or as supporting. So in marketing and maybe even commemoration, but I contend that art actually can be more in a leadership role, and it a lot of times is. It's actually what causes things to happen. So I want to talk a little bit about that idea. But before I get to that part, I just want to mention one thing that'll kind of come up a little bit later, and that is the role. I'm going to talk about the role of the artist, but the role of the viewer is a really important one. And what does the viewer bring to the art? And I would contend and request that the viewer brings a lack of expectation. And that's because if you look at an artist's work without expectation, then you're going to have the opportunity to see what the artist is showing, possibly knowingly, but also, very importantly, possibly unknowingly. But it's that lack of expectation that's very important to the piece. This painting, I just brought this because I wanted to make a point, tell a little story that's sort of tied into that idea of expectation. I had a guy come over doing some tree work, and this is not actually the painting, it was a postcard, and I brought some of the postcards. I couldn't find I didn't have a JPEG of the painting, but I put some of the postcards on the Save Mount Diablo table, so if you want to pick one up, see what it's similar to this, and it'll give you a chance to go to the Save Mount Diablo table, so put in a word for them. But anyway, I had a guy come over and do some tree work for me, and we were talking after he was done, and I gave him one of these postcards, and he went away with it, and 2 weeks later, he drove up in his truck, parked in front of my house, and came in, and he said, "I want to shake your hand. I had to stop by and tell you this, that when you gave me that postcard, I looked at it and I said, what are these colors? And that's not Mount Diablo." And he said, ever since you gave me that postcard, as I drive around, I look up at the mountain and I see those purple shadows and those colors that I never saw before, and you just opened my eyes to a whole different way of seeing. So it was really, thank you. Yeah, it's a nice thing to hear. So getting more to the power of art. Since the beginning of time, art has been a great connector of people. It's how humans have expressed themselves, communicated, shared experiences in every society, race, and culture throughout history. I stole this quote from someone. I wish I could credit it. I have no idea where I got it, but it makes the point I want to make is how important art has been throughout history. A lot of times, if you look at ancient art, that's all we know about a lot of cultures is the art that we have to look at and to project from. So as far as art and its ability to change awareness, I'm just gonna, and we don't have a whole lot of time here, so I'm gonna go quickly through about 3 different points, but this idea of changing awareness, I'm gonna show this one particular case I think is a really good example. I don't know how many people are aware of this photographer, but this guy, Carleton Watkins, was in San Francisco in the 1860s when photography was just invented or just becoming commercialized. And he actually had an 18-inch by 24-inch camera. So the negatives, the glass negatives that he had to carry around were 18 by 24. And he was hired by the mining companies to go out and photograph their raping, pillaging of the local environment. And when he did that, he would do that, but he also would take his own photos that are just quite beautiful. He put together portfolios of this work, and they're in the Stanford and Berkeley and places have his portfolios. But he went to Yosemite and spent a bunch of time with John Muir there, looking at, there may or may not have been glaciers there was the question they were asking at that time. And these photos that he took, the portfolio he put together, was sent back to Lincoln, President Lincoln in Washington, D.C., and it was a major part, said to be a major part of what got Lincoln to start the process of making Yosemite one of the first national parks. So these photos were, incredibly powerful that way. I put a couple of my own in here just because it kind of tied in so nicely, but here's me sitting out there on a February morning. Fortunately, I had my North Face down jacket on because it was really cold. But anyway, painting the falls there, and then the watercolor that came from that, and then the oil painting that was done after that. So this is a 24-inch by 36-inch oil painting that kind of the progress there. So this idea of the power of art and getting people to see the world differently. I've got a couple other photos here of other people, and I always like to talk about Christo, the artist, because I'm a big fan. When this, how many here saw the running fence when it was in Sonoma County? So when this happened in 1976, I went up there kind of like, this guy's, wrecking the land with this fence that's going to go across Sonoma, 18 foot high, 25 miles. The man did everything right. It was just politically correct. It was environmentally correct. And when the day I drove up there, it was a very foggy day, and to see this is just a photo I got off the internet, but I've long since lost the slides I took. But seeing the fence going through those hills and the fog, and it just gave you a new appreciation of the beauty of the environment. So since then, I've chased him around and seen other things he did, like the umbrellas going over the grapevine in LA and stuff. So amazing guy, and just getting an awareness for people. Another artist is, if you're not familiar with, Andy Goldsworthy, amazing guy, and there's quite a bit of his work in the Bay Area. He works with found things in the environment. These are fall leaves that he's just arranged into this wonderful mandala type circle, but he works with wood and water and ice and rocks. There's a really nice big piece of his at the Anderson collection at Stanford. The DeYoung has a big crack of his. They're over. He's a pretty prolific guy, and there's some great coffee table books. So if you don't know him, check it out. But getting people to really have a further awareness of nature is a wonderful thing. And I'll show you in a second how he affected me. But I also wanted to just take this outside of, I'm talking about visual art because that's what I do. But it's true for all the arts, and I thought this was a real interesting thing that I got from another talk somebody else did, but I thought it was important to share. So a few years ago, in a tribute to Bob Dylan, Jimmy Carter said that there's no doubt that his words of peace and human rights have been more incisive and much more powerful and much more permanent than any president of the United States. Which I just thought, that's amazing but it's true that music lasts longer than the presidents who were in power during that music. The next photo I'm showing here, this is, I'm showing this for Paul. Where's Paul? Anyway, this is a large watercolor of rocks that I did a whole series quite a few years ago of these rocks. And when I was sitting on the beach arranging the rocks, I found myself lining up the quartz vein and very much thinking of Andy Goldsworthy when I did this. So he was impacting me. So this was called Homage to Andy. Really important series that I did. When you go to the beach, you always look at the rocks, they're so wonderful, and then you pick some up and bring them home, and you get home and you kind of wonder why you brought them home. I don't know if you have that experience, but, and this was a way of leaving them at the beach and actually having that same meditative experience at home. But the other thing I want to mention with this slide, and it's the only slide I have for this concept, but I want to just say something about the language of art. And I think it's a really important point to make about what is art. And when art is a language, it's a human activity, and the artist must learn that language. It's based on elements and principles and all sorts of things like that. There's that Malcolm Gladwell time thing involved. I use shape, color, contrast, and objects to speak my language of art. There's other artists who use other elements and principles. But once a student of art becomes fluent in that language, the language of their medium, they're able to create an authentic expression. And so the idea is artistic expression has to do with technique, and how an artist can actually realize ideas so that people have the space to think about what motivated the works. And so I just wanted to make that's one point. And the other point, sort of similar to that, and it's already come up like 3 times already with speakers, but the importance to us as humans, obviously language is probably arguably the basis of a lot of our civilization, but story. And as I said, it's come up a number of times, but story is really important. And I have 3 paintings of 3 oil paintings of my own to use just to make that point. I've done, for the last 3 years, I'm not doing it this year, but I've worked with a group over in, thank you, wow, in Marin to do these paintings to help save the mountains and the landscape. I just got a 1-minute warning, so I'm speeding up here. That's it. Anyway, when people look at this painting, hopefully you have a story that comes up in your mind about a similar road that you went down, and it just becomes a story. Another story, this is Steep Ravine, a wonderful environmental campground. I won't tell the story here because I'm running out of time. And one last one, this this painting is obviously rocks and trees, but the story part of it is, I named it The Meeting Place. And by giving it that name, I think most people suddenly make up their own story. For me, it was a Native American thing. Other people said, oh, no, that's not what it is. It's, so just giving it that title gave it the story. Just got a couple more slides. Let's stop thinking about artworks as objects and start thinking them as triggers for experience. That's a Brian Eno quote, the musician and conceptual artist. But I think that was a really important thing to say. And then my last slide, I just want to say about this with this image as wallpaper. When I paint a landscape, it's because I want to spend time with it. I'm not, thinking philosophically but what comes out on the paper or the canvas is for you to judge. And if you have expectations, you might be disappointed. But if you come with an open mind, hopefully you'll see what I see, and most likely much, much more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. We have a question from our app.
Whoa. Why did it go over? Because the machine wouldn't work.
It's not your fault, right? It blames technology. Yeah, it's Steve Jobs. The question is, John, do you take a picture of your subject or do you paint on site? I'll let you have the mic.
Well, thank you. Both. So those small paintings I talked about, the plein air, that's all done on location, and I usually take a photo. So, for instance, the waterfall painting, the watercolor was done on site, but then when I got back to the studio, I did the painting, and I had both the small watercolor to work from and the photo. Working from the photo alone, it usually doesn't work. There's something missing. So, but painting on location, a big painting, there's a lot of painters who claim to do paintings on location, big paintings, and every once in a while there are people that do it, but most people are talking story because it's logistically difficult. Any other? Questions or
one more question. Hold on a second. I'm going to pull up my Slido app here, and I'm going to refresh it. Is there somewhere in Contra Costa you haven't painted yet and hope to soon?
Wow. There must be. I don't know. It was interesting. The painting Marin was interesting because I know Contra Costa. I grew up in Lafayette, and so I've been in this area forever and seen all the changes going on. So I think I know this county pretty well, but Marin I don't know. And so when I joined this group to paint over there, they're called the Baywood Artists, the reason I did was because I don't know that area around Mount Tam, and so I was able to spend 3 years going over and learning new areas there. The reason I quit was because it is really a pain to drive to Marin nowadays. It used to be not a big deal, but it's such a commitment that I just couldn't do it anymore. So if anybody has ideas of places that need to be painted in Contra Costa, I'm always looking for new places. So let me know. Where'd he go? I'm gonna sneak it up.
Yeah, you never know where I am. Anyone else? Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned the group that can follow artists and observe them painting in the open air. Is there a name for that group?
Yeah, no, it's just what a lot of communities have found out is that having these plein air events in their community is a great way to bring people into the community. The artists pay to enter, so they've already got up front. They've got like $50 or $100 from each artist, and so the event's paid for itself before they start. And then the artists who are chosen will go out and paint. So they'll have maps they give the artists, and they share those with anybody who comes. So there's one coming up, I think, fairly soon in maybe Mendocino. So if you went up to Mendocino, they would give you a map, and you would be able to go out and see what the artists are painting. And then hopefully, when the artists bring their work in and show it, you will bring out your checkbook and buy one. But so it's just a event by event. Yeah. Any other questions?
Any other questions?
They want to go to lunch.
Well, they have to sit through. No, they're not going to sit through. They're going to enjoy 2 other speakers before. John, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah. All right. Our next speaker is Samantha Cohen. She is with the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, and she's doing very important work tracking how rising sea tides are going to affect East Contra Costa County's watershed. That is an extension of the ART project that meaning the Adapting to Rising Tides project, which some of you are probably familiar with. And she's going to give us a look at what the future holds for the East County shorelines and a representation of how our communities will be impacted. Samantha Cohen, come on up.
Thanks for that introduction. So I'm also going to be talking about ART, which is the Adapting to Rising Tides program, and it's a part of BCDC, or the Bay Conservation and Development Commission. So the project that we're just finalizing is the East Contra Costa County ART project, and it's a study looking into how sea level rise is going to affect the shoreline of East Contra Costa County. So today I'm going to give you a brief overview of the process that we did in order to find out how sea level rise would affect the eastern part of the county. And then I'm also going to tell you what's at risk and some adaptation solutions to address those. So ART has also done a bunch of different projects around the Bay. We started in the West County, but the East County has a slightly different model that it would need to do, so we had to split it up because of the way that the tides affect the water all the way up into the Delta. So we've also done things in Alameda, East Contra Costa is there, and then we just finished up ART Bay Area, which is our first region-wide look at how sea level rise is going to affect the Bay. So keep an eye out that for early 2020 when the public report is released. So what is ART Eastern Contra Costa? This program is looking into how sea level rise is going to affect the vulnerability of the shoreline and looking at adaptation solutions. And it's a collaborative, stakeholder-driven process. We had a working group that we worked with people from the county, and it's also informing other parallel processes going on, such as ART Bay Area and the Delta Stewardship Council, who funded this. They're also doing a sea level rise vulnerability assessment right now. And they funded this project, and we're also working with Contra Costa County. So the objectives of this project are to model and map future sea level rise, to do an assessment of multiple assets looking at various scales such as transportation or wastewater systems, as well as to incorporate some of these findings into local city plans, to understand the consequences if some of these assets fail, and to look at adaptation responses, as well as understanding pathways for how to implement some of these responses. So the working group was an integral part of this process. If you were a part of the working group, I'd love for you to just stand up. Great, or raise your hand. I'd like everyone to give a round of applause to these folks. These are the real water warriors in the county because they spent many hours checking through our work and making sure that the work was done right and giving feedback on everything that we did. So the working group consisted of various county agencies, various cities, representatives from public office, regional agencies, state and federal agencies, and private entities. So this is a diagram of the ART process. First, in order to do a sea level rise vulnerability analysis, you start with scoping and organizing. So that's getting together your stakeholders, that's choosing your project area, identifying your climate scenarios that you're going to use, and setting resilience goals. Oops. Next is assess. So you have to review the existing conditions and assess the vulnerability and risks. Then is define. So you want to characterize the vulnerabilities as well as identify the key planning issues that are affecting the area. Then plan, which is trying to create adaptation solutions that you would then implement and monitor. So this is the project area. It starts from Pittsburgh on the west and goes all the way to the eastern edge of the county down to Clifton Court Forebay, which is right there. And these are the various sectors and assets that we analyzed. So we looked at businesses and industries, at some critical facilities such as police or schools. We looked at various energy sectors such as power generation. We looked at housing, natural areas, parks, people, transportation such as rail or roadways, and water such as water conveyance structures, wastewater, or stormwater. So this is the Ocean Protection Council sea level rise scenarios. As you can see, in just one decade, there's a 50% probability that sea level rise will meet or exceed 5 inches. So this is a problem that we're going to be facing very soon. By 2100, this range from 12 inches to 122 inches is from low risk to extremely high risk. So the next thing we did was pick different climate modeling scenarios that we wanted to look at. So MHHW, or mean high or high water, is basically just high tide. You can think of it as that. So we did existing conditions, 12 inches, 24, 36, and 83. And then we also added a 100-year storm to that. The consequence of adding a 100-year storm is that this is something that could happen tomorrow. While sea level rise is a long-term threat and would cause permanent flooding, a 100-year storm can happen very soon and also cause non-permanent flooding, so something that's just temporary. Another thing that we did was create resilience goals with the working group. And this helps guide the adaptation solutions to ensure that the adaptation solutions we create meet these community resilience goals. So now I'm just going to go over how you do an exposure analysis. So we had some consultants create flood models for the Delta. And right here is shown with a 100-year storm event and 36 inches of sea level rise. Next, you overlay the asset that you want to look at. So this is agriculture. Then you highlight where these two things intersect, and that's how you find what things are exposed. We have an online flood explorer. You can go to this website and you can look at the various flooding that's happening in the county, and we also have one for the Bay. This is what the website looks like. There's a slider on the left that goes over the various scenarios. You can toggle on and off the 100-year storm. There's a location search, so you can put in somewhere you're interested in looking at. And then you can click on the water level and see how deep the flooding is, and even see in red the areas that will overtop, or the low points in the shoreline that are the flood pathways for water to get inland. So some of the general impacts of sea level rise is that you're going to have more frequent flooding of existing flood-prone areas, more extensive, longer duration flooding, shoreline erosion, elevated groundwater, as well as a possibility of increased salinity intrusion, which could possibly corrode equipment or affect water quality and water supply, as well as permanent inundation of areas that are not exposed, and increased liquefaction. Liquefaction is when soil stability is reduced, and when soils are saturated, they're more likely to liquefy. Some of the specific impacts of sea level rise is we determined key planning issues. Key planning issues are just the major cross-cutting issues that face the county, and the rest of the presentation is going to focus on what these issues are and adaptation solutions to them. So Shoreline Industries. Shoreline Industries are located in Antioch and Pittsburgh, and they have a bunch of industrial and manufacturing sites on the shoreline. So this could potentially mobilize contaminants. There's also the Northern Waterfront Economic Development Initiative, which is trying to develop the shoreline. And there's also marinas, harbors, boat rentals, bait and tackle shops, and that's a major source of jobs in the region. The next is vulnerable communities. On the right is highlighted some of these communities, which include parts of Pittsburgh, Antioch, Brentwood, Byron, and the Delta Islands. So those that are low income, linguistically or socially isolated, without access to a car, elderly, very young, disabled, homeless, undocumented, or mobility challenged, they're less likely to be able to prepare for, respond to, and recover from flood events. They may face difficulties evacuating and finding resources, and many of these community members may face permanent displacement or homelessness after damaging flood events. The third is access to services. So there's a lack of redundant transportation options in the project area, such as the Antioch Bridge, the Bethel Island Bridge, and some of the ferries. And roads can be blocked from flooding, which could result in citizens not being able to access emergency services or grocery stores or hospitals. The fourth is ad-hoc flood protection. Some communities are protected from coastal flooding by rail lines, shoreline parks, or tidal wetlands. Rail lines like this picture are typically built on earthen mounds, which can actually act as protection for some communities. Tidal wetlands can help reduce wave height and coastal erosion, and shoreline parks typically go from sea level and rise up in elevation. So while these built and natural areas help reduce flood risks of adjacent communities, they're not specifically designed as flood infrastructure. Number 5 is parks and open space. So these are the first line of defense against flooding, and they're also key early adaptation opportunity sites. So damage or loss of these uniquely valuable parks could affect habitat, recreation, and the health of the community, and could also include loss of access to open space, bike trails, fishing piers, or boat launches. The 6th is levees. This map on the right shows subsidence in the project area, which is outlined in red, and it goes from 0 to 15 feet below sea level. So communities and agriculture rely on levees in order to keep their land dry. Current pumping practices exacerbate subsidence, which is when the soil sinks, and many districts don't have enough funds in order to maintain these levees. And sea level rise and subsidence could become worse due to sea level rise because there'd be increasing pressure on the levees from water, as well as increasing the liquefaction potential of these levees and increasing the reliance on pumps. Breach of these levees could cause catastrophic loss of life, livelihoods, and assets with significant impacts to the state's water quality and the economy. The last one is worsening water quality. Sea level rise is likely to cause a worsening of water quality due to contaminant mobilization and salinity increases from the tidally influenced bay reaching all the way up into the delta. So as mentioned, flooding can mobilize contaminants from industries, businesses, roads, or lawns, or farms. And there are millions of people and hundreds of thousands of acres of farmland that depend on water from the delta. Groundwater could also experience increasing salinity close to the shore, possibly affecting these water supplies from wells. And the saline water could also corrode some infrastructure and also affect things such as landfills, septic tanks, wastewater treatment plants, and even habitats. So that was all very depressing, and now I'm going to get into something more optimistic, which is looking into adaptation responses. So what is an adaptation response? It's a cluster of actions that help to address the vulnerabilities and help prevent the vulnerabilities or the asset from systematic failure. These are some of the West Contra Costa priority actions that were developed. Number one was to develop and disseminate guidance to business and industries on the best practices for reducing the impacts of flooding. Number two, create a public-private shoreline working group tasked with developing a plan to fund and implement shoreline solutions. Number three, develop a countywide program to monitor, maintain, and repair the shoreline. Number four, establish a public-private partnership to better understand the consequences of flooding on commercial and industrial supply chains, employee access to job sites, and regional transportation networks. So for Shoreline Industries, for each section I'm going to show a low-hanging fruit, which is something that's easier to implement or something that's already happening, and then a priority action. So for the low-hanging fruit, consider future sea level rise and flooding with future iterations of the Northern Waterfront Economic Development Initiative, and consider changes in general plans and zoning to balance incentivizing economic growth with shoreline flood protection. The priority action is to form or expand existing public-private partnerships to develop a regional plan to protect pipelines, marine terminals, roads, and rail lines. The next, for vulnerable communities, would be to develop an outreach program conducted in all locally spoken languages and educate communities about their flood risks and the actions that they can take to reduce these risks. Support community-driven proactive relocation of high-hazard areas by providing funding and technical assistance to help relocate vulnerable communities. For access to services, one of the low-hanging fruits is to build or strengthen relationships between public agencies, nonprofits, faith-based groups to increase neighborhood flood resilience. A priority action is to conduct locally refined analyses to determine the sources of and potential solutions to flooding that could damage critical routes for emergency response and services. For ad-hoc flood protection, advocate to the federal government to require that railroad owners work with communities to protect or relocate rail lines. And initiate tidal wetland restorations to protect and enhance the benefits that they provide, including flood risk reduction. For parks and open space, you can educate the public about the early risk to parks and sea level rise and the benefits that they provide, such as flood protection, and the opportunities for adaptation that these sites have. We could also establish a new authority or expand an existing authority to plan, fund, manage, and maintain shoreline solutions. For levees, one of the low-hanging fruit is to develop new microgrids to create a more resilient energy system so that pumps can continue to operate even when power is off. We can also model how sea level rise and combined with major storms will affect levee stability and update design and engineering standards accordingly. And last, for worsening water quality, educate and provide resources for folks who use wells to ensure that they're aware of the potential impacts that their wells face from salinity increases, as well as increase green infrastructure and low impact development so that rainwater can infiltrate into the ground and reduce the salinity in the groundwater. Finally, I know I just gave you a whole bunch of adaptation solutions. We developed evaluation criteria with the working group, and this is a way to rank these adaptation solutions and figure out which ones are high priority. The things on the right are the different categories that we have, and it's also a way to understand some of the holes and gaps and strengths that these adaptation solutions provide and enable you an easier way to understand which are the actions to move forward with. So as I mentioned, the final report will have a public release in early 2020. You can email me to get on an email list for that. And I'd also just like to advocate that in 2020, we will continue working with Contra Costa County, even though our grant is up. And if you'd like us to come speak at your agencies or better understand how sea level rise could affect your agency, please reach out to us. I'll take any questions now. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak.
So there was just one question, and this is kind of a general question for all of our speakers. Will your slides be available online? And the Watershed Forum is happy to help. The Watershed Forum is happy to help distribute or give access to the slides from any of our presentations. So that was the one question that you had. Okay. All right. Next, we have another keynote speaker, Dr. Ana Alvarez, who's with the East Bay Regional Park District. Let's see. There. So I've had the opportunity to have a few conversations with Ana about what we're going to talk about today and how the face of conservation is changing and what it's going to look like in the future. So I'm happy to introduce her and let her carry this story forward.
Good morning, everyone. I am delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. Have to acknowledge our board members from the East Bay Regional Park District who are here with us today. We are hosted by St. Mary's College, but we're also being hosted by Director Coffey's award. So we have Director Coffey here with us today, as well as Director Lane, Director Rosario, and Director Whitney. And our board members are very much engaged and are very much part of each of their communities in their respective wards, and that's probably part of the secret to the success of the East Bay Regional Park District. I would also like to acknowledge, as you're looking at my slide and thinking, what a weird conservation slide, but I would like to acknowledge the science that's in this room, the diversity that's in this room, the vast knowledge and levels of expertise and commitments that have been made by most of you throughout your tenure. So with that, please indulge me, and if you can just turn around, or if you feel comfortable, get up and give a thanks to the person sitting next to you and say thank you so much for your work in conservation, because you are part of our legacy. Conservation belongs to all of us. Thank you, Director Whatnot. Okay. Thank you for doing that. I would also like to acknowledge who we are. As I share with you, I see a lot of diversity of age, diversity of I see color in the room, which is beautiful to see the color. I see gender in the room, gender differences. What I don't see much about, which is good that I don't see it here, is a difference in terms of thought. because we all share the same environmental ethic and value in this room. So I'm glad to see that we are home, and that there is great power within the collective impact that we have in this room. I would also like to take an opportunity to acknowledge that the lands that you're seeing behind me once a time belonged to the Bay Miwok. And it's important to acknowledge that we are standing on those lands, as beautiful as they are and as inspiring as they are. They once belonged to the Miwok here in the Bay Area. And as you look at the land, I also have to make tribute to the Ithaca place where we stand. I made a decision to come and be here with you geographically. We are in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is very unique in so many ways. It's home to all of us, but what makes it so beautiful and attractive is the open space, is the combination of lands that come together from California state parks, from our national park services, the GGNRA, from the land trust organizations, as well as governmental entities like special districts, such as our water utilities districts, and other special districts like the East Bay Regional Park District. There's over 1.6 million acres of open space in Northern California. And I left fleeing sprawling suburbia in Southern California because I wanted to move forward. I wanted to join you in moving forward very critical issues that would really define the solutions for a changing climate for generations to come. Today, I'm not going to speak to you about the science behind climate change, which is usually what I typically do, but rather I want to take an opportunity with the invitation from Eliza to take a look at conservation from a different perspective. The pictures that you saw here were missing a couple of things. One of my observations first coming here is, where's wildlife? And I want to understand the ecological systems and the ecological functions and how it overlays and overlaps with the thriving of wildlife in the land. As much as it moves me and as much as it empowers me to talk about the beauty of the open space, it has more than an aesthetic value. It has an ecological function, and it also has a very critical function to be able to create that natural space for wildlife to live. But it also has another connection that oftentimes we have a tendency to conflict with, which is the intersection between those natural spaces and people. And if we're going to be speaking of conservation in the future in terms of who we are, who we were, and most importantly, what we're becoming, it must incorporate people. And we belong and people, the intersection of people and nature is really what's going to be able to drastically move the needle in terms of being able to address those very difficult issues such as a changing climate, because land and open space, whether it's the soils that by the riparians or other ecological systems on those lands that are really going to bring forward those natural based solutions to a lot of issues that come with climate change. One of the pieces that as we think about who we've been and who we are, we oftentimes think First, we think about the past, and we definitely have to acknowledge that we're here on the legacy of many others. But today, in the times in which we exist, and in the times in which we're trying to address conservation and moving forward the conservation movement, we have to acknowledge the fact that we're living in very difficult times where we have issues of identity politics permeating the decisions that we make and the resources that we provide to be able to continue to steward the land or to manage public parklands. We also have to acknowledge that while we're having a lot of identity politics, we also have we cannot stop nature, and we continue to see the effects of extreme weather patterns that are making our ability to manage the land and to continue to conserve that land even more difficult. And in addition to that, we have seen and we feel the effects of what the changing global technology has come to impact us pertaining to how we manage our democracy, and also, most importantly, the connections pertaining to social media and how social media has influenced those social connections in our democracy, our decision-making, our resources, and all of that trickles down to our ability to manage and conserve open spaces in the natural world. And I'm going to say that, I just said that in 30 seconds or less. We can have a whole conversation about that for days. But one of the things that I say to people when I speak of these issues is that we tend to gravitate towards what's difficult, and we having difficulties seeing what's really in front of us in terms of the opportunities. And those opportunities in terms of globalization and social media and the connections and all those challenges that I just mentioned to you is that we have to be able to recognize and acknowledge that we're part of a global society in which we now can see what's happening with the people of what we like to refer ourselves as the global majority. These are the majority of people of color who reside on this earth, who are actually carrying on that conservation and environmental movement in their respective countries. And another time I would like to share with you some of those stories of women, children, and men who are really losing their lives, literally, in places like Mexico, the Philippines, Brazil, and India for the protection of those forested areas and natural areas to be able to address or be able to preserve what remains of the open space. But when we tell the story here in the United States about our legacy of conservation, we often think of we have a prevailing view of understanding this conservation history with the prevailing views about race and class, which have influenced the conservation movement throughout our history. In part of our narrative, we may have fallen into the issue that we don't acknowledge or we don't continue the narrative from a holistic perspective to understand what did happen here. And while we do beautiful interpretation services and programs in our environmental education centers, whether it's at the national parks visitor centers or the state parks, or even our own local interpretation centers, we have a tendency to forget that it was actually the Native Americans who can continue to teach us and who have influenced our science and our conservation and how we conserve these lands more than their own cultural history. I don't know how many of you actually know that one of the most effective strategies of conservation and mitigation has been to separate people from nature, to allow those pristine areas and to create wildlife corridors in certain spaces. Well, that notion actually existed decades, hundreds of years ago, and it came about through, and has been shown through the American Indians. 10 minutes, wow. I can give you other examples from other indigenous groups throughout Latin America and in other places. We tell our story, and we tend to forget the voices of the people who contributed to the development of the lands. And while we may share some historical facts, we don't have a tendency to say the whole picture. I love this picture because this represents and reminds me that it was the people of color who actually, in so many ways, through their tears and their sweat, that they were able to build the most iconic, beautiful parks, public lands, such as Yosemite, such as Golden Gate Park, and other open spaces. This is the first park rangers in the United States. They were in Yosemite. They're referred to as the Buffalo Soldiers, and they were African American. We also, in terms of who we're becoming, we have a natural disappearing world that we're trying to get a handle on. And oftentimes I say to folks, it's really about the future generation and making those difficult decisions about what should remain in terms of conservation and preservation, and really whose responsibility is it, and for whom are we doing this. conservation from a social perspective, from a social lens, and it brings forward issues pertaining to health and issues of environmental justice. This slide speaks to the impacts from a disappearing natural world, which is the new terminology I'm using instead of climate change, because climate change has all connotations, and when I speak nationally, in the Midwestern states, I have been told not to use that term if I want to speak there, literally. So I'm calling it the disappearing natural world. And on the left-hand side, you see all of the effects of climate change. You see the resiliency that can be brought forward by bringing the ecological functions of the land. And then I speak about the health perspective of the impacts of those effects from climate change. But today, in speaking to conservation, is from a lens of cultural relevancy and environmental justice. And that's the far column to the right. And basically, the story in terms of the whole slide or the matrix is that the effects of climate change or the disappearance of the natural world is disproportionately impacting community of color and people of color and people that may not have the means to be able to adapt and may not have the means to be able to attend to those issues. Here's Contra Costa County, and the blue, it's interesting how the colors came to be in terms of the census from 2010. This was almost 10 years ago. I can't wait to see what's going to come back in 2020. But the blue is the Latino community in Contra Costa County, and for the Anglo-white community is the green. Look at the changes. This is in 2000, what happened 10 years. And thank you to Abby Fitman. Thank you to our board of the East Bay Regional Park District, because look how drastically the slide changes in 10 years. Now we're moving into open space. So the majority of the changes is the acquisition of open space, but also the fact that we have less blue, and that speaks to the socioeconomic dynamics of that the ranches that were being worked by mostly Latino families, they have been displaced by the acquisition of open space. And that's okay. There's consequences and trade-offs here, but there's also a higher concentration of biracial or mixed race populations. 20-something years ago, I was having a conversation saying that my children were probably the minority because they were biracial children. My children are now in college, and actually they are the majority, because the majority of the students coming into the colleges and universities are multiracial and biracial. In Contra Costa County, it's important to understand that 35% of the people here speak more than one language. And they're not bilingual, they're trilingual. And also about 57% of the population come from a biracial or mixed race. And we see an increase of about 30% in terms of the degrees that are being conferred to folks that are finishing college in the Latino community. And that's important to understand, because those are the same people that we have to bridge to and reach out to be able to continue the conservation movement, to continue the work that you've done, to continue the legacy of those iconic people. It's important to know also that while we have implicit biases and we often generalize people of color to say, well, Ana, when you speak of people of color, they typically don't vote. And I said, no, excuse me. Just in the Latino community, the community where I belong, the majority of the people actually can vote in California. As a matter of fact, we carried the vote for Proposition 68. It was two Latino senators who moved forward Proposition 68, Eduardo Garcia and Kevin De Leon. And understanding that people of color do vote, and they're becoming the majority in California and the United States, they feel very strongly, equally as much as we do in this room, about ecological issues such as climate change, air pollution, soil and water pollution. Here's the latest poll pertaining to how Latinos feel in terms of the issues that they wanted to bring forward with the change of the new federal government, the new administration. And you will find that immigration reform came in fourth to their priorities. Their number one priority was to do economic recovery. Second to that was strengthen the Clean Water Act and increase conservation for water, reduce smog and air pollution. Then it was immigration reform. And then right next to immigration reform being 80%, 79% of the people felt that protecting our nation's wildlife was very important to them. And then we go into developing clean energy, and it continues on to speak to issues of the environment. And combating terrorism comes right at the heels of climate change. And terrorism is tied to immigration for many issues, for many reasons. And that, again, is another conversation of many, many days. But that's just to show you how much conservation is an integral element of the Latino community, because it's embedded within their heritage. And that is also true of most communities of color. They have an embedded heritage relationship with the land. When we speak of the land, we speak in terms of our land, and about the importance through intergenerational relationships with the land. And that came through very quickly in Proposition 68. This is the census tract for who voted in Proposition 68, and you will see that the majority of the votes came in where we had the greatest amount of diversity or demographical diversity. And this is just the slide for Contra Costa County. I have 1 minute to tell you about the future of conservation. But the future of conservation looks very much, it's about diversity, but most importantly, it's about the interconnections of the social sciences. It's called the intersectionality, and basically speaks to the overlapping intersection of the social identities that affect and inform how the conservation movement will continue to evolve. And most of the time when we speak of the intersectionality, or those social intersections and overlappings of social issues, most of the times we're speaking to systems related to exclusion, at times even domination, or the fact that our stories are not included as we think of conservation. And that intersectionality has to be looked upon very closely as we speak about resiliency from a changing climate, the intersection between people and nature, people meaning all of us, and as well as the intergenerational transfer of knowledge. Very quickly, I want to give you the perspective in terms of transition from a social lens and from a cultural relevance place, how people of color see the conversation that we've had in terms of when we speak of diversity. In the 1970s, when I was coming into the field of the environment, I was taken back by, at that time, we were speaking about diversity, tolerance and diversity. And I said, tolerance, I tolerate certain things, but typically what I tolerate, it has a hardship to me. But at least there was a level of awareness that there were other people in the room. And then we moved to diversity, and diversity really speaks to acknowledgement, that we acknowledge that we're diverse in many ways, in gender, in color, in heritage, and in thought. So there's awareness, acknowledgement of that. And now we're speaking of inclusion to a certain extent. And inclusion really speaks to, now that we understand that we're different, we're inviting you to come in, and we're inviting you to come in. And I said, well, thank you for the invitation. We're included. But really what we want to get to, and the work that's being pioneered by the Haas Institute of Othering and Belonging at UC Berkeley, it speaks to issues of belonging, where we can say we all have a collective impact, and if we truly acknowledge the responsibility, the ownership, and we can acknowledge that we are the minds of that natural world, that we can together with our full humanity be able to address those issues of conservation and have an ethic, an environmental ethic that brings forward social equity. We have a tendency to manage the land when we put out bilingual or signs into the land that says, don't do this, don't do that, don't do the other. That doesn't speak to belonging or very welcoming. Instead, what I would recommend that you think about, and I worked in perhaps one of the most beautiful park systems in the world, and I saw misbehavior of park visitors that cross cultural heritage lines. Misbehavior is misbehavior, and it comes in all different colors, shapes, and sizes. It really does. And I can talk to you about my experience at Dolores Park if you like. So when we want to manage the land correctly and we want to alert people, the best thing that we can do is to use symbols and to be able to use more graphics than words and talk about from why does it matter. Lastly, I would like to spend a few seconds talking about, as we think about creating that strength that comes from diversity. In this room, we all know, and we have all well observed, that when diversity is not valued, all life is diminished. So when we think about the intergenerational transfer of leadership in the conservation movement, we have to really think about issues pertaining to our own implicit biases. And we all have those biases, including myself. And we have to shift our lens to be able to see what's really, really in front of us. I was having a conversation with a dear colleague of mine, and I said, look, if you really want to bring communities of color into the workplace, communities of colors into the conservation movement, communities of colors into the technical professionals, environmental sciences. You have to really, why do we have a tendency to gravitate to what's the most difficult? Why can't we acknowledge that within those communities of colors, there's a wide socioeconomic spectrum? In those communities of colors, in that spectrum, there's people who are newly arrived immigrants who are besieged by all kinds of socioeconomic issues. Then you have the middle class, second, third generations, fourth generation. And then you have, on the other extreme, perhaps a newly arrived immigrant, perhaps a second generation. But you have, on the other extreme, people who are highly educated, high middle income or high income, and have a high ethic for conservation, very well assimilated. And literally, as I'm having that conversation, the answer was, I don't know anyone like that. I've never met anyone like that, Anna. What are you talking about? They don't exist. And I had to say, no, it really happened. I go, and I said, I'm right here. And they go, no, but that's you. And I said, no, there's many of me. I am not the exception. I'm not the anomaly. Did you know that our chair of the State Water Commission, perhaps one of the most important water commissions in California, and for the future of California, is Armando Quintero. Beautiful Spanish that he speaks. Beautiful culture, beautiful story, and he's a naturally born U.S. citizen in the United States with an incredible trajectory in the National Park Services and conservation. And he's saying, Anna, can we bring a work to a school to work program with the East Bay Regional Park District, just like I did in national parks? I said, absolutely, we can work on that. So we have to think about the spectrum, the socioeconomic spectrum, and we really have to shift how we look at people. And the last thing I have to say is that in my journey, I started really understanding the sciences. It was about everything that moves you. It was about, I'm a birder. It was about the climate science. It was about understanding water. And now, at this age in my career, I am being called upon, or I feel I'm being called upon, to address those issues that come about with identity politics in the conservation movement. And I plead to you that to shift your lens if we are to move this forward. It's a very critical moment in time, and while there's urgency to address those issues, we also have to be very patient and empathetic, and we have to bring people along. We have to bring them along with us, because my experience has been, Anna, you don't understand. intergenerational pain from the discrimination and the oppression that people have felt, and it's very difficult to manage that. And I say, yes, it is. I understand. I have a better understanding, and I am very much moved by the Black Lives Matter movement. Yes. I will acknowledge, yes. And on the other side, I have conversations literally. Well, Anna, yes, I don't look like you. I'm a white male in his 60s, okay? And I am being left behind, not given the opportunity, because the interest from the governor is to diversify. Yes, I understand that. Yes, it can be very painful. Yes, when we speak of diversity, it's not at the exclusion of white people. It's inclusive of. So can we have a future when we can be inclusive of people and be truly diverse? And yes, it hurts, and yes, I can empathize. And so today, I only look at you and I say, can we recreate those bridges instead of breaking when we're hurting, when we're afraid of the change that's coming very rapidly at us? And can we find a common ground when bound by our environmental ethic to move forward that which is so important to us, the environment? Thank you so much.
Thank you. There are a couple quick questions for you on that wonderful presentation that you gave. So one question was about your background. What field is your PhD in, and what was the topic of your dissertation?
Oh, thank you so much. My PhD is in planning, policy, and development, and my field of focus was climate change at a time where climate change was barely coming out. So I was a very masochist pioneer. And my dissertation was a resiliency plan on climate change for San Francisco's parks. And I was very blessed and very privileged to have the support of the folks in San Francisco to allow me to shift the frame in how they manage those parks.
Thank you. And there's one other question, but I'm going to have them catch you off stage for this one, for what was Prop 68 about?
Okay.
Oh.
Okay, so all of you can speak to the park bond. It was a water and park bond. It's a proposition in the last ballot measure in California. 2 ballot measures ago, and it was the first park bond after 16 years that brought forward $4 billion. $4 billion to address very critical issues pertaining to resiliency for the effects of climate change, infrastructure, the protection of lands, the protections of water. It was a beautiful movement by many people that was led through the Trust for Public Lands, the conservation, the League of Conservation Voters, the East Bay Regional Park District, and many others. And it actually passed. And thank you to Northern California, who carried Proposition 68. So in many ways, what I can say, Proposition 68 speaks to the beginning of the first step to be able to continue with protecting these lands.
Thank you again. All right, I know that we're all ready for lunch, but I have one more thing, 1.5 more things before we make our way into the other room for lunch. We have Supervisor Diane Burgess with us. She's come to give us a proclamation, I believe. And you'll remember her from the last symposium, especially where she was your planner and she was in front of you talking. And I think we had, what's his name on the video behind us from outdoor, the back roads. Yes, Doug McConnell, thank you. Yeah. Yes, here you go.
Good afternoon. I love being the person between you and lunch. 12 years ago, I attended my first symposium. It was my first day on the job with Friends of Marsh Creek. I had no background in water quality or habitat restoration or planning or any of those things. But after attending and seeing Mitch Avalon recognized and seeing the passion that people have for this work, I was so excited. I was like, I get to do some really great things. 4 years later, I'm standing on the stage getting a Watershed Champion Award. And that was because I found my tribe. So hi, tribe. I learned about water quality and habitat restoration, and I learned about how to bring people together to appreciate what the value is in our creeks and our watersheds and our natural resources. And then 4 years later, I got to plan the symposium, which was so much fun, and to bring more people together. And 4 years later, I'm now a county supervisor. It's hard to even say. But I've got to say, I've been surrounded by smart people, passionate people, and I've learned so much from you. So it's a real honor to bring you a resolution from the Board of Supervisors recognizing the 20th anniversary of the symposium. And I really appreciate all you do. It's important. It connects people. It preserves. It protects. It raises awareness. And it's such important work, and it's fun. So I appreciate all you do, and go have lunch. Thank you. Here's your thing.
There you go. How does this work?